large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Hello, Zero Books readers and viewers. Welcome to another Zero Books live stream and podcast. This time I'm here with Ashley Frawley and Andrew Doyle, who's a comedian. And I'll let you introduce them more, Ashley.
Yeah, so Andrew Doyle is a comedian, an author, and the creator of the Twitter and now stage personality, Titania McGrath. So welcome, and thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us.
No, my pleasure.
So the reason why I wanted to have this conversation is that we were, well, first of all, you're just a very interesting guest, but also we were booked to do a tour, which has been postponed now, obviously. And so that's part of the reason. So obviously I'm on the editorial board of Zero Books, and one of these days would be great to steal you from your big publisher and get you to write a book for us.
Well, maybe.
But we're also going to be talking about the culture wars and in the time of the COVID-19, I guess.
Yes.
For people who don't know who you are, I mean, you're fairly well known, especially in the UK. But for people who don't know who you are, you've worked with Jonathan Pye. You co-wrote that series, is that right? And you're well known
for 3 years. 3 years, I co-wrote the character, and we did a number of things. We did weekly videos and 2 live tours and a TV thing as well.
Right.
Things here and there.
And I don't know if this is the case overall, but it seems like because you weren't on camera, you may not be as well known for that as you are for another character that you developed, Titania McGrath. Is that her name? Who was online Twitter warrior. So very briefly, I know you probably talk about this a lot, but what originally motivated you to create Titania, and do you consider that to have been a success?
Sure. So the idea was to characterize through satire the kind of online social justice activist who will go online and find things to be offended about and find things to be upset about and read sexism, homophobia, and racism into absolutely everything. Talk about how oppressed she is, and yet she is herself very, very privileged. So that kind of hypocrisy. And I thought the best way to do that would be through satire. But also, if you're going to approach that kind of individual satirically, the best thing is to use the forum that they use, and that is Twitter. So rather than just write articles or sketches or something like that, I thought I would just try to recreate the type of person that I'm satirizing. So that was the idea behind it. But really, it was just to entertain myself.
Did Titania get a lot of fans who would defend her worst takes, or how did people respond?
Sometimes there was a recent case where, and I can't remember her name, but an activist in France who is known as the face of social justice over there retweeted her in a positive way and was very happy with something she'd said. So there have been moments. I remember the feminist Naomi Wolf talking to her or replying to something she said as well. So sometimes people have taken her very seriously. She was invited to an American talk show as well to discuss one of her points. So that does happen. Which sort of puts pay to the accusation that it's a straw man, that there's no one out there who's really like that. Because if that were the case, then no one would consider it to be real. And yet, every single tweet I send, even today, there's always someone in the comments who thinks this is real, has taken it at face value. And you would, because it's not a million miles away from what people are actually saying.
Well, you know, your recent article in Spiked is about whether or not the coronavirus will kill the culture wars.
Yeah.
And the other way to put it would be, will this virus infect and kill off a certain kind of online cultural warrior or the social justice warrior movement? And I had felt before we even got infected here in the United States that the day of the social justice warrior was over. And that was because of how some things had worked out in the 2020 presidential campaign with Bernie Sanders.
Yes.
Specifically, it was the Elizabeth Warren campaign that made me feel like, okay, now the masks are off. There's no pretense of this being an actual movement that puts forward, like socialism or some sort of move towards positive change, but it's clearly just a way to weaponize identity for your own political purposes, and often, I think most often, as a way to defend the status quo.
Absolutely. I mean, you're right, because again and again, the people who advocate most strenuously the social justice ideology tend to have absolutely no class consciousness, and indeed are interested in supporting the status quo economically, which and that's, if they really cared about equality, then that would be their priority. That's not the way it works. It seems like a lot of the times it seems like tokenism. And when you have someone like Elizabeth Warren, I think the point in her campaign where I thought maybe people are going to wake up to this is when she said she would ask a 9-year-old trans child to veto her Secretary of Education. That I just thought, come on now, people.
Yeah,
this is ludicrous.
That was a low moment of pandering. I thought the worst moment was when she accused Bernie Sanders of having said that no woman could become president,
right,
and used it as a very targeted way to try to just derail his campaign. And while it didn't derail his campaign in that moment, it did create enough of a fracture between her supporters and the Sanders campaign, so that she had a way to not endorse him for clearly political reasons, and to not get out when all the centrist candidates got out, and sort of use that as an excuse, that the sexism both of Sanders himself and of his supporters. So I just felt as though in that moment when she did that, it became very clear that anyone who was actually on the left had to oppose that kind of politics. But
you would have thought that it wasn't. I mean, because it's so clearly not effective as an electoral strategy. I mean, there's that book by Mark Liller called The Once and Future Liberal, which is quite rigorous in the way it approaches this, and there's no real place for identity politics as being a winning electoral strategy unless it's coming from the right, because I think identity politics on the right, in terms of nationalism and the kind of that even jingoism occasionally, seems to work. Whereas I think when it comes from the left, and identity politics on the left takes the form of this kind of oppression Olympics, this grievance, this hyper-racializing approach, it doesn't work, and it never has. So you would have thought just strategically it would be wise to move on from it.
Actually, on the left and right thing, one of the sort of accusations that gets thrown around when you criticize the left is that you must be a right-winger.
Yeah, it doesn't really work like that, does it?
Yeah. Do you get that? How do you respond to that kind of?
I get it. I'm just assumed to be right wing. I get called Tory scum, even though I've never voted for the Tory party, so I'm not doing it very well if I'm a Tory supporter. And I get called far right and alt right and all these sorts of epithets, which do not remotely apply to me. So I think it's just it comes out of ignorance, doesn't it? I think the assumption that if you criticize elements of the left, you must therefore be opposed to the left. Actually, the opposite is true. If you care about a movement, then you're more likely to criticize it if you're being serious about it, and you're more likely to hold it to high standards. So I think it's just also people don't like hearing the criticisms, and therefore it's a good way to dismiss what you're saying in these very sort of tribalistic times, when the very idea of being right wing makes you just a pariah and some kind of leper, not worthy of consideration. Then just calling someone that is sufficient within certain circles to entirely dismiss them, and therefore not to have to engage with them. So it's more than anything is a strategy.
Yeah, I think also what they want you to do sometimes, when some of the criticism that I've got is that, okay, yeah, we accept these criticisms, but why don't you criticize the right? Or like during the election, I got a lot of hate online for criticizing the Labour Party's obsession with identity politics, which, in the end, I think did them in. And because it was like, well, yeah, okay, you got to be critical, but at the end of the day, you must endorse. You have to say like, okay, but at the end of the day, you still have to vote for them.
Right. Yeah, that doesn't really make sense. I mean, in terms of the Labour Party, you're absolutely right. I think it made them unelectable, identity politics, and I think it continues to do so. Because since the election, instead of addressing that, you had Dawn Butler on TV talking about how babies are not born with a biological sex, didn't you? I mean, that was almost immediately afterwards.
Yeah, and it like immediately just sort of went down into this spiral.
Yes.
Like I just felt like, God, you people just delete your Twitter accounts.
Yeah.
Go out and talk to somebody on the street.
Yeah. But as to, do we have an obligation, therefore, to criticize the right? Well, firstly, I think I do. I do criticize the right anyway. The Jonathan Pye character for 3 years I wrote was predominantly, overwhelmingly attacking right-wing politicians and political ideas. So I think I do anyway, but I don't feel I would be obliged to. My particular focus at the moment is going to be on the left, because I want us to have a credible left-wing option, which we currently do not have. So obviously that's where, I mean, I sort of take it as a given that I don't support certain right-wing policies. You know, anyone who knows me knows that I don't. So why would I bang on about it? There would be no purpose to that.
So I have one question for you around the Labour Party. And as an American, I'm really asking a question for you to inform me here. But my understanding was that what did Corbyn's campaign and the Labour Party in most of all was their waffling on Brexit.
Yeah,
and
I think that's right.
Was that attached to some sort of commitment to identity politics? I guess the Remain position was the identity politics.
From my perspective, you can't separate the Brexit debate from identity politics, because it became a linchpin for identitarians to latch onto. And so therefore the debate about the European Union, which was largely to do with sovereignty and the economy and whether or not we want to be part of this neoliberal trading bloc, became reframed as a debate of whether you are a good person or a bad person, as in, do you want to remain or do you want to leave? So are you morally good or are you morally bad? Are you racist or are you anti-racist? And that's what it became, this very simplistic thing. Now, nobody was denying that there are racists in Britain. No one is denying that at all. Tiny minority though. There's not many. It's not the norm. And certainly the vast majority of the people who voted for Brexit are not racist in any way. So it was a completely false narrative that was perpetuated by the media. And that narrative was indeed wrapped up in the notion of identity politics. So therefore, I do think the two things are inseparable. It did, unfortunately, because the most working class people voted to leave, 70% of Labour constituencies voted to leave. This meant that when Labour started saying they would campaign for a second referendum, they were effectively spitting in the faces of many of their supporters, and particularly their traditional support base in the industrial heartlands of the north and places like that. I mean, you know, it's called the Labour Party. The origins, it was formed in order that working people could be represented and heard in Parliament. That's the whole point. So therefore, and people, I think people don't understand the extent of what it would have taken for people living in these areas to vote Tory. It is astonishing. These are people whose hatred of the Conservative Party is deeply embedded and has been ever since the Thatcher era. So for them to go out and say that, look, their vote has been ignored, their voice has been completely dismissed, so their only option was to vote for a party that they loathed, and that cannot be emphasized enough. This is an absolutely astonishing thing to have happened. And yes, at the heart of it is Brexit and identity politics and a complete disregard for democracy from a party that purports to stand up for the working class, but has in fact become gentrified.
And within that, the latter point, I think that what I was noticing too is, like, in the last days up to the election, you really got the sense that it was like a charity drive. You know, it was like, your one vote can save a child from sleeping on the floor of an NHS hospital. You know, and it's like, it's not a charity. I noticed that the relationship between, and this has been a gradual kind of shift, the relationship between the people in power and the electorate has changed from one of equals and representatives to like parents and children. And people realize that and absolutely resent it. And so there's this sense that we're just like victims and objects that just need to be moved around. And, you know, welfare is like, that's the big thing, you know, state provided welfare. And if you talk about jobs, ooh, that's like a Tory thing. I'm sorry, but it used to be about the right to work, not the right to welfare.
Absolutely. And there's a real dignity that comes with being employed. And there's a real, I mean, there's always a risk with socialism that you're going to end up being paternalistic. Of course, that's sort of part and parcel of it. But the emphasis, like you say, should be on people empowering themselves. And people kind of resent, I think, being talked down to and patronized like that. I don't think it plays very well.
So I want to push back on you a little bit here. Not that I disagree with what's been said so far fundamentally, although I think we could debate about whether the right to work rather than, let's say, the organization of the working class to the right to seize that, seize the means of production should be the goal. But
I'm not saying that it's the end goal of everything that we do, but it's certainly important.
I know, and I was being
recognize that we have our agency in the public sphere.
Yeah, I was being facetious there, but I do want to talk about the this article on the coronavirus and the culture wars, and also talk about the culture wars as being two-sided, because while it's true that we have the woke scolds online, we also have, and this has developed, for many years now, and I think it kind of started to come up around 2014 on YouTube and places like that in the atheist community on YouTube, was a kind of an anti-woke or an anti-social justice warrior movement, which while coming out of a kind of a liberal and atheist community at first, has sort of been picked up and has a history on the right as well. The anti-PC right, the right that will use this weakness of what they call the left to perpetuate their own agenda. And I think in the world of media, things get split between kind of like let's say an MSNBC woke set of channels, and then a Fox News anti-woke right-wing set of channels. And when you start to make certain kinds of critiques of the left, you easily get slotted in towards the right, not just in terms of how you're perceived by your fellow leftists, but also in terms of what kinds of opportunities are opened up to you. And so I wanted to ask you if you had thought about that and how you address that problem.
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot. I think it's absolutely the case that the culture war is two-sided, and you have culture warriors on both sides of the argument who behave in bad ways. And unfortunately, of course, if you are critical of woke culture, as I am, you will automatically be branded as an anti-woke culture warrior. And that, again, is a strategy in order to not really listen to what you're saying. Actually, the kind of anti-woke culture warrior is the sort of person who will go on about political correctness gone mad, or will talk about how, you can't say anything these days, or the sort of person who would call everyone snowflakes if they are displaying any kind of human sensitivity. This sort of thing I do not do and openly oppose. I was also very supportive of the notion of political correctness as it manifested in the late 80s, early 90s, because I felt that it was important to move towards a shared social discourse of politeness, and not to be enforced by speech codes or to be enforced by the state or anything like that, but that we have a kind of generally broadly agreed way that we speak to each other, and we don't go around calling gay people faggots and things like this, because we still have the option to do so. I mean, I do believe in free speech, absolutely. But now we've got that sort of broad social contract. It simply means that if you do persist in that kind of impoliteness, then you will be rightly ostracized and treated with all the scorn that you deserve. So those things are to do with cultural sensibilities, which I think are good. And this is why I've never been the sort of person who goes on about, political correctness has gone mad, you can't say anything anymore, because that also is not true. You can. I mean, I say exactly what I want at all times and have never been censored. I am aware, however, that is a luxury that I have because of the nature of what I do, and it would not be a luxury that I would have if I still worked at a call center or if I still worked as a teacher and things like that. So, so it's very difficult in all political arguments. I feel where they fail, and largely on social media, is through mischaracterization of the opponent's viewpoint. And unfortunately, once you start talking in terms of woke and anti-woke, it's very easy to slip into the mischaracterization mode. It's very different when I'm Titania. Obviously, she is a certain type of exaggerated form, because satire often uses exaggeration to make a broad point. So I'm not saying that there are people out there who say exactly what she says. Occasionally I will say stuff that they do say, but you know, it is a deliberate exaggeration to make a point. But when I'm talking about political discourse and conversations like this, I think it's important not to mischaracterize your opponent, to actually faithfully replicate what they're saying, and actually acknowledge that there may be a grain of truth in it, which I think is true of the social justice movement. A lot of it is really well-intentioned, and I support the core values of being opposed to racism, opposed to homophobia, the idea that of equality and fairness. And the truth is that's what social justice means. And everyone is for social justice, virtually, with aside from a few nutcases and neo-Nazis and that kind of thing. Pretty much everyone, anyone who's serious, is for social justice. But we are opposed to social justice capitalized, as in the social justice movement, which does not represent social justice, but actually works against its aims inadvertently. That's why it's very complicated. Now, I know that James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose have just written a book called Cynical Theories, in which they distinguish between social justice, lowercase s, lowercase j, and social justice, uppercase s and uppercase j, in order to make the distinction. And that's why it's so complicated to attack the woke movement, because even the word woke, in terms of its definition, is a positive thing. It talks about being alert to injustices, particularly related to racism. Again, well, by that definition, I'm woke. You know, so by the strict definition of social justice, I'm also for social justice, and yet I'm anti-woke and anti the social justice movement because they don't represent the things they claim to. This is why it's so difficult to penetrate this argument and to explain to people that what you're actually advancing is a liberal worldview, when what the social justice movement is advancing is an illiberal, reactionary worldview.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. I think that whole left wing of the political spectrum that sort of bequeathed to us from the French Revolution has really collapsed in a lot of ways.
Really?
And what we have left is really the left and the right of what was the old right. So this emphasis on culture and human difference and like the Volksgeist. And it reveals itself in some fairly disturbing ways. So whereas the old left was for democracy and for the human subjectivity, the powerfulness of human subjectivity and equality and so on, the right was more ambivalent about mass democracy and the masses. And that's the one thing that I find to be really disturbing about a lot of this, because the idea of wokeness often implies that everybody else is sleeping. So there's this kind of anti-mass sentiment to it as well. And I think that's very dangerous, that kind of like looking down on the mass of people that can go down a very anti-democratic kind of line. And when you mix that with, you know, an obsession with human difference, well, we've done that before. It didn't lead us very good places, you know. So I worry when we lose that, when that liberal, that, you know, that whole left wing of socialism, communism, liberalism, when all that collapsed, all that's left is this squabbling of identities, and that's a very dangerous thing.
I totally agree with you, and I also think it's very good that you mentioned the left-right distinctions emerging from the French Revolution, and of course the word reactionary comes from that period as well, originally a French word, to describe those who were uncomfortable with change. And unfortunately, that is what the woke movement is. I mean, it's difficult to frame it this way, but if you think about it, what they are effectively doing is unpicking the work of the civil rights movement and opposing the essential notions of the civil rights movement. They're uncomfortable with the change that has affected, and they want to return to an illiberal society, a different society, but nonetheless illiberal. And therefore, the true reactionaries are those within the social justice establishment.
Well, they would say that it's a continuation, and that actually the word itself has come from the civil rights movement. What would you say to that?
And that's the problem, is that by framing it in those terms as a continuation of the civil rights movement, much as, for instance, Antifa framed their activities as a continuation of the people who fought on Cable Street, who were actually opposing real fascists, as opposed to someone who tweets out a microaggression or whatever. Yeah, I would say that they're not being, well, I wouldn't say they're not being truthful. I think they believe that their work is a continuation of the civil rights movement. But if they think for a second that Martin Luther King would have supported the divisive politics that they pursue, then they are kidding themselves, frankly.
Well, even at the time, there were different, you know, strands of the struggle for civil rights or black equality in the United States, and you had Malcolm X out there as well, who had a more black identity kind of politics, and you had in the 70s the movement for Black Power, and black capitalism. And Adolph Reed has a really good analysis of some of the things that came out of, I mean, for historical reasons and not in a way to condemn some of the best activists at the time, but some problems that came out of the New Left. For instance, the move from struggling for material rights and rights for political representation, the move from that to a struggle around relations between the races was significant according to Adolph Reed, and I think it's true, where now instead of political struggles, you had cultural struggles, and you had these a rising upper middle class black elite who could be kind of brokers of their communities to the white elites and work on that level. But I want to ask you about some of the things that you've written about in your piece that I think are being misrepresented, not only by the people who you quote, but also in a way by quoting them, you're obscuring some of what's going on in their work. So, for instance, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, she was talking about how COVID-19 is hitting minority communities and having a much more devastating impact there than it might in, let's say, Beverly Hills. And I don't know what the numbers are, but I do know that just sheltering in place in a more impoverished area is going to be more difficult. And if you want to see the real truth of that, you look at, the difference between developed and undeveloped nations. But what I wonder is if there's a way to pick up some of the causes that she's talking about in her tweet, or the main point of what she's talking about in her tweet, but critique the way she's doing it, because it seems like her tweet was designed to be divisive and to kind of be a virtue signal kind of tweet.
Yeah.
But there was actual meat and substance underneath it.
This is my point. This is why I was saying you need to acknowledge the truth in what your opponents are saying, and there is undeniably a race class association that goes on, particularly in America and particularly in places like Chicago, and that is worthy of attention. It certainly merits scrutiny. And I think yes, it was more that was a particular. I was quoting her tweet because I was criticizing the language that she was using, and she chose to talk about the lens of reparations. For instance, she's trying to, it's more about the like you say, the deliberately divisive rhetoric that is unhelpful, and not least because it does obscure what might be a very valid point at the heart of it.
Yeah, I mean,
that's one of the dangers is that what happens is when everything is racist, nothing is racist. Like I found it so hard to draw attention to what I think is literal life-destroying institutional racism, particularly in, for instance, Canadian immigration policy, because Trudeau is so slick. And he says all the right things, and then nobody really looks very closely at what he does. And then I say, no, look, this is like racist immigration policy. It's literally based on the idea of the other as, so culturally different, in a country that's supposed to be multicultural. And there are loads of examples. And then people go, oh, you're being an SJW. And I'm like, well, no. Jesus, when you call out, when you point out that, look, you're taking this a little bit too far when you see racism and everything, you're not saying there's no racism. Like it's still a very serious issue, and it's particularly obvious in immigration. So people will paint blue flags on their face to celebrate the EU. Yeah. An organization that has horrific racist, a horrifically racist attitude to non-Europeans, and nobody says anything about that.
It's really dangerous when the terms like racist and fascist become unusable. Because they have been misused so frequently, and also when they become associated with a certain mindset, like you say, the social justice activists who so promiscuously use the term racist devalue the term racist, and it's actually a very important term. We need to hold on to what the actual definition of it is so that we can identify, because it's such a great evil, and so therefore we have to have a way to identify it. Now, when I hear someone being called a racist online, my default assumption is that it's not true. And of course, that should never be the case. And that's a really bad, and like you say, the European Union is a very good example of this, the way that they fund, you know, the dictators in Turkey, where was it, Libya, I think, to keep people out, to keep people in camps, keep them away. These are clearly racist policies. But
and this obsession with language makes us like, when we're all we care about is how people say things. Well, then we get into a situation where if something sounds good, well, it must be, hey, I'm talking in the language of victims here. And a huge amount of implicitly racist policy goes on through a very caring language, caring for the vulnerable, cultural continuity. In fact, a lot of I see proper colonialist ideas being rehashed through very caring language. And people go, well, no, they're talking about victims. They're talking about mental health. They're talking about caring about people. And because we're so obsessed, we think that racism is supposed to be in your face or how people, in how people talk. And then if it's something sounds very kindly and good and caring, we're not alert to it.
I think
in the case of AOC's particular tweet, by saying she wanted to frame the issue through reparations, she was taking up a very unpopular approach to racial justice and taking a crisis which was affecting everyone and asking people to consider the problems that people of color are facing through this lens of a very unpopular, divisive policy proposal. I mean, I'm not saying I'm against reparations ultimately, but it certainly will be a much more difficult struggle to get through something like reparations than it would be to get through real legislation to help people who, for instance, are living in a food desert.
And yet they would do the same thing. Why call it reparations?
Right. I mean, especially
that was the point of quoting it. That's why I quoted it, and I don't feel I obscured it because I also provided a link through the original.
Yeah, the more I think about it, the more I'm realizing that. But the problem is when you're writing about wokeness and in the amount of space that you were given, that it's easy to let the depth of the problem maybe slip by, or not everything can be addressed. But because I really do think, like, when a politician uses woke language to signal to their base certain things, but doesn't reach across the aisle or reach to a mass audience to get something going in real political terms, they should be called out for that. And so when AOC tweets like that, what she's not doing is tweeting about real proposals.
No, and of course, Twitter is not the best forum for politicians. Let's face it; it's such a short character limit. And I in that sense, I do sympathise that it's quite easy to be unclear on such a forum. You end up having to talk in sound bites, which isn't good. By the same token, it's not that difficult to avoid language that is more likely to divide people up than to persuade. It's not that hard.
So do we want to, would now be a good time to take some questions from the chat, because there have been people who
are there actually people here then?
If you can see how it says private chat and live comments. I didn't know this for a long time, but you can click live comments and you can see them.
Oh, is it just you fascists?
No, they're not.
There's some
that.
Good ones. There was a super chat one that was good.
Yeah, well, there was a super chat one that I missed.
Yeah,
but down here.
2 minutes ago.
Here we go. There's one. They can't even talk honestly. Now you see that says an awful lot. This is one of the major problems in political discourse at the moment: the assumption of dishonesty. And the assumption of dishonesty comes from a genuine narcissism, because what it means is that you cannot fathom or conceive the idea that someone you're talking to could possibly hold a different viewpoint than you. And the only explanation for that must be that they're lying. Why else wouldn't they think the way that you do? So it's a very revealing accusation, and it's often leveled at people. And unfortunately, not just by idiots as the person on your live comments, but people on in public discourse. Politicians are doing it, media commentators are doing it as well, and it's hugely unhelpful.
Someone says to us, and wokeness is the left-wing expression of bourgeois disdain for the mob.
Yeah, I honestly think that. I saw that come up. I was like, ooh.
Absolutely, there is a real bourgeois heart to wokeness. I mean, it's no accident that the loudest cheerleaders of the cause tend to be very privileged people, economically speaking, and it's also no accident that year on year, the universities that tend to be the most hysterical when it comes to woke policies tend also to be the most privileged and where the wealthiest students go.
That's always been the case. I mean, romantic reactionaries were always very privileged. You know, they wanted, you know, they looked with horror at the consumption habits of the working class and wanted them to be the good peasants that they had been. You know, the king should be a good king. You know, they wanted to go back to the sort of Christian paternalist ethic. And you can kind of see that now, this idea that, you know, a lot of what's being mistaken for the left, I would associate with the romantic reaction.
Yeah, this is why I think it's important that we break this narrative that the social justice movement is coming out of the civil rights movement, or is the natural progression from it, whereas actually it's coming out of a postmodern academic movement. It's not the same thing at all. And this is key. And what that is a very sort of paternalistic thing, that we know best. We know what's best for the masses. They don't know what is best for themselves. And we know how to detect the hidden power structures because we're trained in critical race theory. So we understand the nebulous power. We've read Foucault, you haven't. The little people, like, you don't understand this stuff. So we are uniquely placed to be able to detect this. That's why we have things like unconscious bias that we will be able to rectify. And it is very much a kind of master-servant dynamic.
And postmodernism was expressly reacting also to liberalism. And I, you know, in my own research, I see this all the time where people will, who criticize this obsession with mental health and obsession with, like, you know, positive mental health and all these interventions and so on. The number one criticism is that it's a form of neoliberalism, that it's attempting to create an ideal neoliberal subject. It's not, because if it had been neoliberal, we would have just thought that people have that capacity. You wouldn't need to go in and inculcate it within children and think that without it, people would just be these weaklings. I think it's an expression of the collapse of that liberal project and that understanding of liberal subjectivity, and it's just widespread and pervasive that even when we criticize things, we criticize it through the language of rejecting liberalism.
So someone asked earlier, way earlier, about anti-Semitism in the Labor Party, and I can't find that original question, but I want to ask you: do you consider the way that Jeremy Corbyn was accused of being anti-Semitic, or the party was being accused of anti-Semitism, was that an example of a kind of identity politics and wokeness, or do you think there was a real difficulty with anti-Semitism within the Labor Party?
Again, I would say that the accusation of anti-Semitism is as serious as any of these other accusations we're talking about, as in accusations of being a racist or being a homophobe. It should be taken extremely seriously, and also should be only leveled when there is explicit evidence for it to do so. Now, when it comes to Jeremy Corbyn, he himself, I've never heard him say anything anti-Semitic. However, it is certainly a failure of leadership when he does not acknowledge clearly anti-Semitic tropes. For instance, I mean, when he was cornered by, now let me get this right, was it Andrew Doyle who was questioning him and quoted a Labour Party member who had expressed what was clearly an anti-Semitic trope? And Corbyn, it had to be sort of wrung out of him. He wouldn't admit that this was an anti-Semitic trope, and that isn't to say, and he did eventually admit that it was, but that was quite revealing, because what he was trying to do was keep people on side within the party who were happy with those kind of tropes. So whereas he himself may not be anti-Semitic, he's certainly not addressed the issue in a serious way. So I don't think this is about wokeness. I think just calling someone anti-Semitic if they disagree with the Israeli government's policies on any given subject is an example of wokeness, and is a sort of knee-jerk, very sort of lazy way of thinking. However, that said, there will be some anti-Semites who hate Israel. You know, it's, again, I just think all of these things need to be very seriously considered, and accusations should only be leveled when there is incontrovertible evidence to do so.
I think that the anti-imperialist left has a lot of course, there's a lot of very serious things and good criticisms, and has been an important part of the left tradition. But it also has tended in the last, say, 30 years to at times bleed over into an anti-Semitic approach, especially around Israel. And that when you're thinking about and organizing around the rights of Palestinians for years and years and years, it's almost inevitable that certain anti-Semitic ideas are going to be part of your.
And I've seen examples of explicitly anti-Semitic statements from Labour Party members, and that should be dealt with, obviously. But I've also seen examples of people expelled for criticism of Israel, which I'm nervous about. I'm not happy with that. So You know,
Yeah.
I think it should be about treating each instance on its own terms.
Mhm. I think I don't know. I'm just going to say this for the viewers. People who are interested in the left's problem with anti-Semitism from a kind of theoretical perspective should check out the works of Moise Pastone, who was a Marxist theorist who died last year. But let's see if we have any other questions from people here. Someone says that anti-Semitism has always been an undercurrent of British society as a whole. What do you make of that?
It's difficult for me because I'd never known or encountered or heard any anti-Semitic statements or phrases until I was well into my 20s. So it wasn't something I'd ever come across. It wouldn't have even occurred to me. Or it didn't even make sense to me. And then I did hear some shocking statements, and it suddenly hit home that there, you know, and certainly over the past few years I've seen an escalation of that, and it's disturbing. I don't know whether it's an undercurrent of British or this country generally. I don't feel qualified to make that. If I did, it would be speculative. I made it.
I'm wondering, you said that people who do espouse anti-Semitic views, that should be dealt with. And I assume you mean like they should be removed from the party. I mean, is there a danger there? I mean, I agree with you, but I'm just wondering, is there a danger there of kind of trying to, is there a parallel with trying to remove from public life ideas that are just bad ideas?
Yeah, well, it's not comparable to what you would call cancel culture. I'm not calling for anyone to be arrested. I'm not calling for their livelihood to be destroyed. But I'm saying that to be a serious left-wing political movement, you have to be explicitly anti-racist, surely. So I don't think, I think the Labour Party is well within its rights to expel members who are racist. I think that's fair enough. But I'm not suggesting they are silenced or censored. They are free to say whatever they want to say, but they don't have a right to party membership.
So a lot of this is produced like some strange bedfellows, because I feel like, you know, this some of the people that I feel like initially, you know, when I started criticizing the left and so on, initially started, you know, following me on social media and so on, were not like my kind of people.
Right.
And I'm wondering, you know, are you comfortable with that? I mean, have you found that kind of situation as well, where on the sort of path to defending free speech, for instance, you find yourself alongside people that you normally wouldn't agree with on anything else?
100%. Happens all the time, and it's particularly over the last few years. And I think it's been quite a good learning curve, because I think I also was very guilty of mischaracterizing my political opponents and assuming the worst of them and assuming the worst motives. And I've met and I've got to know a number of people who have been characterized in the media and public discourse as being sort of monsters and evil and all the rest of it. And they're very decent human beings who just happen to think society should be modeled differently than the way I think it should be. And I think 99% of political arguments would be much better served if we actually listen to what people are saying. And I think, yes, and it has been surprising to me that I've ended up with friends who are on the right. I didn't have any when I was at, you know, and that wasn't me being bigoted or whatever. It's just that I didn't know anyone. I you know, moved in artistic circles. I was in obviously I did stand-up comedy and playwriting and that kind of thing. So you don't easily come into contact with conservatives, but they just see the world differently, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think yeah, I think it goes back to what you were saying about the left-right divide, that actually the culture war isn't about left and right, and that's why you end up with left-wing and right-wing people being on the same side, because what it really is what John Stuart Mill talked about, which is the struggle between liberty and authority. That's the true divide. It's the people who value liberty and people who edge towards authoritarianism, and that's where the divide falls. And that can be, you know, that left and right-wing people share broadly liberal values, you know, most. So that's why you get that those strange things.
You know, you're friends with Douglas Murray now, is that right? So
Douglas and I were going to tour with Ashley until.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
That was the point. So we were
Ashley
doing a tour.
too, huh? Okay.
And
I find Douglas Murray to be just a pretty shallow thinker. I don't know. He's not. People seem to find him impressive, and I find him to be exactly the kind of right wing anti-PC or woke, anti-woke kind of character.
Well, I don't agree with that, because I think he's a very deep thinker, and I think his books are very considered. And I think it's just that I wouldn't necessarily reach the same conclusions. Although, having said that, his last book, The Madness of Crowds, I do find myself agreeing with virtually everything he says in that book. Whereas the book he wrote prior to that, I didn't agree with a lot of what he said. But I thought the arguments were very eloquently expressed and very well thought out. And I think it is a mischaracterization. I haven't heard him or in conversations with him either behave in this kind of anti-woke culture warrior reactionary way. I haven't heard any evidence of that from him.
Okay, well, I'm not gonna. I just thought I'd say that some people were saying I needed to be a little firmer, but I'll stand by what I said about Murray. Although maybe if I pay more attention to him, I'll change my mind.
I mean, to give an example, his book on the strange death of Europe, which is about immigration. I'm sure Douglas and I would not agree on a lot of that. I'm very for immigration, but it's interesting that that book has been characterized, for instance, as being racist or whatever, and of course it's not. And it actually comes from a place of great compassion. I mean, he's gone out of his way to meet the people that this affects directly, to talk to them, and he has a genuine human sympathy for them. It doesn't come out of a hatred of immigrants or a xenophobia or anything remotely resembling that. And I think that's why we would be much better served if people read that book with that in mind. If you read the book with the preconceived notion that it is coming from a malevolent place, then invariably it will be misread.
Well, what I'm saying when I talk about an anti-woke kind of right-wing position, I'm not saying that these people are racist. Like, right. I think that
is the woke strategy, though, isn't it?
It's being an anti-woke right-winger means you see the weakness in your opposition and you focus on that and you go after that as a way to put forward your own agenda. And that agenda you could very sincerely believe in, and parts of it could even be true, right? Yeah. But the part that you're pushing forward the most, like Tucker Carlson, who I don't particularly like either, but I don't think he's the devil. But he's a political enemy. Yeah. He makes a lot of hay out of the way that the college left behaves, and he runs periodically bits about the college left. And it's not because he cares that much about the college left or because it's a hugely significant issue, but it really works because it is so off-putting, a lot of what he's doing.
I wouldn't want to speculate what his motives are. I think that arguments and need to be taken at face value, even if you suspect them to be coming from a disingenuous place. The argument will stand and fall on its own merit, irrespective of the honesty that lies behind it. And it just isn't. It simply isn't helpful to start to speculate about a hidden agenda. This is and certainly with Douglas, we're in the luxury of never having to speculate, because his agenda is he explicitly states what his agenda is. He's explicitly stated what he believes. There's no, I just find this tendency to try to detect what you think is secretly going on in someone's mind, as opposed to what they've explicitly stated, to be worthless, actually, because unless you've got evidence for another agenda, it's not going to get you anywhere. Just address the argument. If the argument is weak, you will be able to defeat it, whether it's
No, I agree. I'm not saying that I'm just saying that the difficulty is maybe when you are let's say you're touring with Douglas Murray, and that you have a political agenda which is of certain type. For instance, you want to strengthen trade unions, as an example that I just invented. And you know that the person that you're touring with agrees with you on the problem of woke culture and on free speech. And that but they're also they're the headliner. They're going to get a little more time, and they're going to be able to talk about against trade unions and in this context. And you're going to be adding your energy to that tour, but you're not going to get a chance to debate for very long, if at all, on that issue. The issue, you're going to be instead spending a lot of time in agreement on the question of wokeness. And so then overall, the effect is that, you know, the anti-trade union sentiment is being pushed along, you know, driven by the anti-woke argument, the cultural argument. And I think like the same thing goes on. The woke people do the same thing. They'll push forward an agenda of tepid centrism, but use woke language to do it and kind of obscure what they're actually doing. So I'm not, I mean, it's not, this is not a, I'm just,
I don't really see why that's a bad thing, though. I mean, like when you're organizing around a particular issue, you're often going to find yourself with strange bedfellows, because if you're alone, you're screwed. You will have no chance of affecting public debate. Around a particular issue, you need to have some kind of organization. So I've worked with groups that I fundamentally disagree with on absolutely everything except one issue. But in order to make headway with that one issue, you need to have the organization that they're offering. On every other issue, goodbye. You know, it's not about socialism in one person. It's not about your own self-contained morality. It's about trying to get something done. And when the issue changes, you leave that person behind. You know, I'm not going to call on Douglas Murray to talk about how pro-immigration I am, except perhaps to debate him if that were to come up. Although I'd probably choose somebody who's better on the issue. But you know what I mean? Like, the idea is that it's like we're supposed to be so morally pure, and that's what socialism or communism has become. It's about how good of a person you are. So people will say, "Oh, why are you on Sky News?" Why? Because it's like was owned by Murdoch. You know, I'm supposed to, oh no, the ownership is not ethical. You know, it's not like, you know, it's not about ethical consumption, ethical lifestyles, ethical speaking. It's about trying to get something done. And if we keep miring ourselves in this endless sort of culture war of self-contained purity, we will never get anything done. And that's where I think what's happened.
Andrew, did you ever meet Roger Scruton?
Sorry?
Did you ever get to meet Roger Scruton?
I didn't. Unfortunately, I would have liked to.
I mean, I saw him in debate with Terry. Now the name's escaping me, but a pretty radical Marxist literature professor, and I really, when I saw that debate with Scruton, I really came to respect him, even though I you know, since I don't agree with him, I thought he was not as deep a thinker as Terry Eagleton, who was the guy on the other side. But I really liked Roger Scruton because I thought he acted in good faith. And I'm not saying that isn't the case with Douglas Murray, but what I would love to see a tour do with someone like Douglas Murray or someone who's on the right today is to air differences.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good thing. It's like Ashley was saying, the idea of debate is a good thing. It's a good way to tease out ideas, refine your viewpoints, and you know, let's face it, we're all wrong about certain things, and that it's good to be challenged.
Yeah, and it exposes your weak points as well, and then I come back with a better argument the next time.
Well, so there's the purely selfish thing, which is I want to be better at arguing, and then there's the thing of I also want to be right, and I want to know if I'm wrong about certain things, and that's why you debate. But I think certainly, yeah, absolutely, a tour like that would be great. It just so happens that we wanted to address the wokeness issue on tour, and the whole second section of the show was going to be a Q&A with the audience. And the reason for that is there's a lot of people out there. We're in a very privileged position that we can talk about this stuff openly. There's a lot of people who are wanting to have these conversations who don't feel, rightly or wrong, but they don't feel that they're able to do so. And that's partly what this was going to be about. So for this tour, it was very much, we weren't going to put someone who was pro-woke against someone who's anti-woke and let sparks fly. That wasn't the concept. The concept was to talk through the issues. And for that reason, it was better that we were both coming from the same angle on this particular issue. But by all means, we were open to be challenged by members of the audience. That was also part of it as well. So
someone asked you if you believe in dog whistling. Do you think dog whistling is a real thing? And they don't mean literally like whistling for your dog.
They mean when politicians use language that sends secret signals out to those who are able to hear it and their support base. No, I don't think it's a thing. I think it's pretty ludicrous, and I think it's often leveled at people, at politicians, falsely. So we had, for instance, what was the one that was done recently? It was here's one. The activist on Twitter who talked about how the phrase "wet markets" was a racist dog whistle. Now, wet market is a phrase that is used by people in Hong Kong to describe the markets that it's not by any means a racist stock whistle. And what's the insinuation here? That you use that phrase and all your secret minions out there, their ears prick up and they've heard this special message that no one else has, and then they're going to rise up. What is the point there? I mean, it's very much like, I think it's ludicrous, actually.
Yeah, somebody in the chat said, what about when push comes to shove, and then mentioned that, some people who had allied, when things got down to it, the allies were shot. It's like Douglas Murray, I don't think he's going to shoot me. And let's not LARP the 1930s. The stakes are not that high. Push has not come to shove just yet. Right. And when it does, my hope would be that we are organized much better than we are today. But I know that you wanted to not to stay on the line for too long. I know that you needed to go. But I wanted to ask you I'm not sure if you've answered the question. What do you think the effect of coronavirus on the culture war is going to be when we come out the other end of this?
No, I haven't answered that. That was the whole point, wasn't it? Well, obviously, first thing to say is I don't know. I don't have that clairvoyant power to see what's going on. And I always predict things incorrectly anyway. I didn't predict that we would leave the European Union. I didn't predict that Donald Trump would win. So I'm very wary of making predictions because I'm no Nostradamus. But what I would say is that the early signs are, firstly, I should say actually that I hope it does bring the culture war to an end. I would like nothing better than to not have to talk about this stuff. I think it would be great when this is over. The trouble is that every time something happens that I think will make the identitarian left reflect and take a different strategy, they don't. They double down and they get worse. Yeah. This was after Trump's election. It was clear to me that they should reflect on this stuff, but they just escalated it to such a degree that it became inevitable that he would win a second term. So I think similarly with the Labour Party, so we're not dealing with people who have a great track record on introspection. So there's that. Also, early signs are that they are definitely, they kept silent, didn't they, for a couple of weeks. There were, we'd got to a point where virtually every day you would have articles coming out which were ludicrously identitarian and ludicrous stuff about identity politics. And then it went silent for a little bit and people thought, they've realized now we've got actual hardship to deal with. So you can stop inventing these things to be upset about, these faux grievances. And now they've started again, pretty regularly. Right, so even today, or was it yesterday, where you had the article in the Independent about how white women who are attracted to Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, are racist. That's a form of fetishizing of people of color, and therefore it's racist. Now, of course, that, by the way, is an old racist. The old trope of being afraid of miscegenation is an old racist trope. So there you have another example of someone promoting a racist trope through the guise of anti-racism, but nonetheless. But no, it's definitely happening again. There's CNN. I've mentioned I've mentioned about 15 examples in that article, like CNN talking about the diversity of Trump's coronavirus task force. You would have to look at the article, but there's a number of examples of people. Vice magazine writing about complaining about trans operations being postponed, transitional surgery being postponed because it's deemed non-essential. But of course, by non-essential, they don't mean not important. They mean it's not life-threatening in the way that someone who needs to go on a ventilator for coronavirus is. So people are trying to weaponize the coronavirus for identitarian reasons, and I'm very mistrustful of that. And they will continue to do so, I think. I want them not to. I'm hoping. Here's the thing. Here's the positive. Here's my optimistic view of this. There have always been these sort of culture warriors on the fringes who say these ridiculous things and scream hysterically about invented grievances. The problem isn't with them, actually, because they will always be there, and there'll always be those people. For instance, students on campus who do this, they'll always be there. Okay, it's no new thing. The problem is people in authority who capitulate to their demands. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. So when you have the Rose Must Fall campaign in Oxford, and you have the activists claiming that they are physically threatened by the presence of a statue of a historical colonialist, the problem wasn't the students with their protest. The problem was that it was, for a second, entertained by the university authorities. In the end, the university authorities didn't capitulate. So my hope is, if I'm going to be optimistic, and I want to be optimistic, is that the culture warriors will become more hysterical. You've noticed that the vitriol has increased. They've certainly become more vitriolic and more vicious and aggressive. But people will simply stop listening to them. and people will simply stop taking them seriously, and certainly they'll stop capitulating to their demands. They won't be firing people from their jobs because they've started an online thing. They'll just ignore them, and that is the best case scenario that can come out of this, and I hope it does.
Well, I'm hoping that we can come out of it with fewer deaths and maybe even steps towards workers' power, as people realize that when they stop working, it has a dramatic impact on the world's economy.
Yeah,
and
this has really exposed the class divisions in society, without a doubt. I think everyone's agreed on that. It's going to hit people who are worse off, and so hopefully this will. All along I've always said, if you want to talk about quotas and if you want to talk about equality, class should be your number one priority. Because it also invariably solves those other problems that you like, racial representation and all those kind of things, if you focus on class, if you focus on helping the poorest in society. And I think that's something that will hopefully come out of this, that the identitarian left, rather than being obsessed with race, gender, sexuality and trans issues, will start to see that the money is what matters.
Right. Well, listen, thanks a lot for coming on. Is there anything else that you wanted to ask Ashley before?
Well, I'd take the conversation on for another hour. So no.
Okay. All right. So what I do now is usually just run the end credit, rolls the same as the intro one.
Thanks so much, by the way. Andrew. Thank you.
I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Yep.
Thank you.
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum